What's up, guys? I'm Nobody Special. And today on Twitter, David Lynn, who's probably best known for being that guy on Kitco who isn't Daniela Camboni, declared that gold was no longer an inflation hedge, and in an effort to rip off a Steven Crowder meme, he said, hashtag change my mind. Well, let's take a look at the chart David posted and see if there's really any truth to that. You ready? Hit it. Thank you for joining me. I'm Jack Gamble, and I'm Nobody Special. And today on Twitter, I saw a chart posted and a declaration that gold was no longer a hedge against inflation. It was posted by none other than David Lynn. But that's not David. Sorry. No, that's not David. David Lynn. No, that's still not David. This guy. Yeah, this guy. And channeling Steven Crowder, David Lynn declared, gold is no longer an inflation hedge. Change my mind. And he included this chart. So at first glance, I look at the chart and I'm like, hey, maybe David is onto something. Look at that divergence. Gold is no longer tracking tips. Oh my goodness, what groundbreaking DD. But as you're going to see, not all charts are created equal, and you really have to get into the numbers to make sure what you're seeing is really what you're seeing. And as you're going to see in this chart, that is not the case. Now, before we get too far into that, guys, I have to ask you, could you please like and subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell. It really helps me out, and I'd be forever in your debt. And with that, it is time to shrink my big fat melon of a head. And in true melon head fashion, let's get into this. Okay. Now, at first glance, I see this chart. It's, gold is no longer an inflation hedge. Change my mind. And what we see here is we've got gold pretty closely tracking tips. But then all of a sudden, we see in August of last year, we had that big spike in gold and the ensuing sell-off, and it looks like that correlation is suddenly broken. And then really, if you look starting in about June of this year, more recently, it looks like now the charts are diverging. So what is going on here? David, you're onto something. Well, not exactly, okay? Now, first of all, first thing I want to point you at in this chart is this is only going back to 2016. Okay, this is a 5-year chart. 5 years. Gold has a 4,000-year history as a store of value and a hedge against inflation. So looking at a chart of 5 years and then basing your conclusion that gold is no longer an inflation hedge based on really the last 6 months of behavior after 4,000 years of history. Okay, that's not really a reasonable conclusion to draw. But we're not going to dwell on the past, right, David? So let's look a little further. So the next thing I want to point out is he's saying gold versus tips on the title of the chart. But if you look down at the legend beneath the x-axis, he's actually showing a tip ETF and he's showing a GLD ETF. Okay, those are not tips and gold. Those are ETFs that track them. And while they do show, the relative direction, you've got things like differing fees and who knows, there's any number of factors that could affect the ETF behavior versus the underlying commodity behavior. So it's not a true comparison. We're comparing ETFs here, okay? Now, I am not going to go back and recreate the charts based on the day-to-day actual tips and the day-to-day actual price of gold. That would be immensely time consuming, and if I want to put out a video every day, I just cannot spend that much time on charts, okay? So for David's sake, let's say the chart will probably say the same thing if I go back and look at tips and look at actual gold futures prices. However, I can't guarantee that. Keep in mind we're looking at ETFs. So that's the second possible flaw here. Now, the third thing I want to point out is your y-axis, okay? You'll see the blue line, the tip ETF. That is based on a y-axis that spans from $98 to $128. All right, that is roughly a 30% increase from bottom to top. All right, now look at the y-axis of your other chart, your gold ETF. That's showing the base of 100 going up to 200. So that is a delta of 100%. So while he's inferring a linear relationship that is now broken, you have to realize this chart is not showing a true linear relationship. This is showing a 30% swing for the blue chart, and this is showing a 100% swing for the gold chart. Now, if you look at it and if you look, oh my goodness, look, tips has continued to gone up, but gold has gone down, keep in mind the scale of the move. What we're seeing on this chart across this time horizon is about a 68% increase in the price of gold and about a 30% increase in the value of this tips ETF. So the conclusion he's drawing here, based on the appearance that the gold chart is now below the tips chart, keep in mind that over the time span in this chart, you're looking at gold more than doubling the move in tips, even though because of the adjustment of scales, it looks like tips has made the bigger move, but on an actual percentage basis, gold has made the bigger move. Okay, so that is flaw number 3. All right, so right away, we've got 3 glaring deficiencies in Mr. Lin's chart here. Number 1 is the timeline is way too short. Gold has a 4,000-year history as an inflation hedge. Number 2, he's using ETFs and not the actual commodities. Number 3, the scales are different on both sides of the chart. And if you really wanted to show a better correlation, you would use percentage moves instead of nominal values. He didn't do that. Now, there's one other very important thing that I want to point out, and it's something that David is overlooking. David is focusing on inflation, and that is not the problem that we're facing, all right? We're not just looking at price rises. And before you semantic trolls start picking apart whether inflation is defined as an increase in prices or an increase in the supply of currency, take whatever you want. An increase in prices or an increase in the supply of money, both are going up, okay? So we have inflation. But what we also have, or what we're also looking at, is periods of low economic growth or even economic contraction. In other words, we're looking at stagflation. Yes, stagflation, that economic phenomenon that has all the Keynesian economists going, this doesn't fit our Phillips curve. What do we do? Shift it to the right. Problem solved. So what I'm more interested is how does gold behave as a hedge against stagflation? And we only have one period in history to look at for stagflation, and that is your 1970s. And with that, we are going to shrink me again. And here is a chart of gold in the 1970s during the last period of stagflation. And as you can see, Mr. Lin, gold performed awfully well during that period of stagflation. Here, let's get me out of the way a little bit. Put me up here. Starting around $35 an ounce in 1970 and ending at close to $600 in that decade. That's a pretty good performance during stagflation. So based on this chart and the fact that economic conditions right now pretty closely mirror the early part of the decade of the 1970s, I'm more concerned about this chart than I am David Lin's chart that shows different scales for 2 different charts that track ETFs instead of the actual commodities and that only look at a 5-year span. Because this is a more relevant time period. The decade of the 1970s more closely resembles what's going on right now than a chart from 2016 to 2020. And this is why I think precious metals, namely gold and silver, but also platinum, palladium, and all the other PGM metals, will be among the best performing asset classes of the next decade. Maybe not the best, but they will drastically outperform stocks. Okay, you can bank on that. But again, I'm not one to dwell on the past. But I also can't ignore 4,000 years of history of gold acting as a hedge against inflation just based on the last 6 months. And there's one last thing I want to mention on David's chart. If you can see in his chart, the one time where the correlation broke right around June of this year is when the 2 charts started diverging. And in June of this year, that was Jerome Powell's infamous talking about meeting when they finally decided that taper was on the table. And I have to say, 4,000 years of history of gold acting as a hedge against inflation and a store against value in the very base of Exter's pyramid, that all doesn't get suddenly crumpled up and thrown out the window because Jerome Powell said talking about or thinking about. And really, that is the premise of David Lin's entire point here, is because for the last 6 months, since Jerome Powell said thinking about or talking about, the 2 charts, his 2 skewed charts, have moved in different directions. He's saying throw out all of economic history because of that. Sorry, folks, it doesn't work that way. Even if these skewed charts were really saying what he claims they were saying, you just can't throw out 4,000 years of economic history based on 6 months of activity since one talking point by one central banker. Just too flimsy, folks. So long story short, I do not agree in any way with David Lin's theory that gold is no longer a hedge against inflation. The numbers don't support it. His chart doesn't say what he thinks he says. There are way too many flaws in his chart, and history speaks for itself. And I think a more important chart is a chart of gold prices over the 1970s versus a chart of gold prices over the last 5 or 6 years, because I think the economic conditions we're facing in the next decade, or the stagflation on a global scale, more resembles the economic conditions of the 1970s than the last few years. Guys, that's all I got for you for this one. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell. It really helps me out. I'd be forever in your debt. Until next time, live small and dream big.